we're up to 55 countries, I think, who have some kind of national plan, and 153 cities or regions who have some either very sort of long-term plan or a very immediate plan to develop these services. And what we've done is that we've put it in a format so you can look at what's happening in the next 2 or 3 years, the next 5 or 6 years, the next 10 years.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 405. What are the current trends shaping urban air mobility? For that question, we head to the coast of England to speak with Philip Butterworth-Hayes, publisher and editor of Unmanned Aviation.info, the world's first internet-based information portal dedicated to the global community of UTM and C-UAS system providers and operators. Unmanned Aviation.info provides daily news on UTM and C-UAS development and deployments, alongside a glossary of system providers and current plans of states and agencies to deploy systems worldwide. Philip has extensive experience as a consultant and writer specializing in air traffic management, aviation safety, military and civil aviation issues. He was formerly managing editor of Jane's Transport Press and editor of Jane's Airport Review, Jane's World Airlines, Jane's Defense Industries, and Jane's Aircraft Component Manufacturers. He has been the Director of Communications and Strategy at the Civil Air Navigation Services Organization in Amsterdam and is currently the editor of Skyway, the official journal of EUROCONTROL, the European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation. Philip is also the editorial director of PMI Media Limited, the specialist contract publishers for the defense and aerospace industries, whose clients have included the European Defence Agency and Airbus Defence and Space. He is a regular contributor on ATM and aviation safety issues to global broadcast and print media, including the BBC, CNN, and the Wall Street Journal. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Philip highlights 5 trends shaping urban air mobility today, and he talks about some of the communities that are leading the way in air mobility. But before we hear from Philip, I want to stress that your support is the heartbeat of my podcast. Every episode is crafted with you in mind, and your generous donations ensure I can keep delivering the content you love. Whether it's the price of a coffee or a more substantial contribution, every bit helps to defray the cost of production. Donate today and be a vital part of the podcast's continued journey to greatness. And for a limited time, donate $100 or more and receive an official Drone Radio Show coffee mug. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And if you can, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and leave a nice review and rating on iTunes. It really helps improve the podcast ranking among the many thousands of active podcasts today. So let's learn about the trends shaping urban air mobility with Philip Butterworth-Hayes of Unmanned Aviation.info. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Philip to introduce himself.
My name is Phil Butterworth-Hayes. I am a consultant and writer on airspace management, drone airspace management, and urban air mobility. My background really is in aviation, defense, journalism, and consultancy. I used to be the director of strategy at the Civil Air Navigation Services Organization in Amsterdam. I spent time working for a company called Jane's, who does a lot of defense analysis work. Worked for the BBC, writing documentaries on aviation. So I've been in the business now for about 30, 40 years, really. And in 2017, decided to specialize very much on the drone urban air mobility area, specifically looking at not so much the the aircraft side, but the infrastructure side, the whole traffic management, vertiports, takeoff and landing, the whole background to it, which is a lot less sexy than the aircraft, but nevertheless has to be thought about quite carefully before we introduce these services.
The publication that you created is called Unmanned Aviation.info. What's its focus?
It's an airspace management site where we really try and look at how U-space and counter-UAS threat detection systems, because they're all rolled into one, really. How are we going to manage the airspace of the future to make sure that we can safely develop drone and urban air mobility services to the benefit of the community and get the balance right and make sure that the bad guys stay away?
How has the publication grown over the past 5 years?
We started out by doing about 6 or 7 stories a week, went out to about sort of 40 or 50, so which is extraordinary as the industry doesn't yet properly exist. So we don't really have, as far as I'm aware, any fully commercial UAS traffic management system working around the world. So, I mean, that's 6 years of writing about something which is not really bringing in that much money. So it's been a frustrating time, really. I thought by now we would have the regulations, the standards, the technology at sort of levels of maturity where we'd be flying drones autonomously, safely with autonomous detect and avoid systems and the communication system that sort of works. We don't have any of that. And it's still really frustrating. What we do have, however, is very clearly, and I think obviously, if we look at the counter-UAS side, the counter-UAS side is evolving at sort of 3 or 4 generations a year, very much as a result of Ukraine. And that has created, I think, a whole set of new dynamics to the industry. It's how you safely integrate drones into the airspace at the same time keeping the bad guys away, and not necessarily the bad guys, but the people who are careless or clueless about the rules, and make sure that everybody is safe and protected and can still make money and can scale up. Because the big thing, of course, is not creating a system that works for today's drones and technologies, but will be available to be there for 10, 20, 30 years' time.
From your unique perspective of covering urban air mobility, what do you see as the top trend defining the sector today?
Well, I think you've got to look at where the money's going. And the money's clearly going into eVTOLs at the moment and getting those certified. And I think there's a sort of belief that if you get an eVTOL certified, you're 3/4 of the way there. And I'm not sure that's necessarily true. So there's also, I think, a lack of clarity over whether drones and, say, doing local authority surveillance missions, whether that's urban air mobility, where you can count that as urban air mobility, or is urban air mobility something completely different? There's still, I think, huge differences of opinion about what urban air mobility is and regional air mobility. And it's getting more confusing almost by the week as we see new vehicles coming in, personal sort of jets and single piloted small vehicles arriving. We've got new generation of potential large cargo, lighter than air machines arriving. So they're all coming at the same time, all with their own different technical requirements. And we haven't yet worked out even the basic stuff, like who actually owns the airspace. And what strikes me is quite interesting. If you look in Europe for a second, you go to 3 cities, Dublin, look at London, look at Hamburg. Dublin, it's the Irish Aviation Authority who has responsibility. In London, it's the landowners, in many cases, the property owners who have responsibility for the airspace above them. And in Hamburg, it's the city. So we're still at the basic stages of where do we start? And some of those basic questions we need to answer pretty quickly before we take it to the next stage.
Obviously, one of those basic questions has to do with what actually constitutes urban air mobility.
I think if you look at the definitions, certainly by sort of NASA and elsewhere, it's a transport system. Well, I think it's more than a transport system. I think it's, if you're using drones to survey, for mapping, for fire services, emergency response, those aren't transport vehicles. They're surveillance, they're monitoring vehicles, and that's a different area. But I personally think you should look at it from the point of view of the airspace, low-level airspace, and rather than the aircraft type. I think that's a much easier way to look at it.
In addition to the funding aspect, what else is driving urban air mobility?
Well, we have new actors coming in. So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how non-aviation actors, local authorities specifically, what role they're going to have in deciding their responsibilities. And that could be where the takeoff and landing areas are located. It could be hours of operation. It's understanding the balance of responsibilities that they have and the National Aviation Regulator has. And that, again, that's a huge, huge area which will make the lawyers extremely rich. But until that's been clarified, and it could be clarified at a granular level, almost every city will have a different set of responsibilities from its neighbours. But we need to work on that pretty quickly because otherwise things will fall down the cracks.
Speaking from my experience as a city planner, integrating air mobility options into the urban environment is exciting. But right now, there's a huge knowledge gap in terms of what can be done and the overall impact on mobility. That's a challenge.
Especially at the moment when quite a lot of cities don't have that much money and didn't have as much money as they had before 2019. So we're heading towards some people call the Uber moment, when suddenly cities had to face Uber arriving on the scene, and they haven't really made any preparations for understanding what this would mean. And I think we're about to get another Uber moment, only this time it's in the sky.
We've hit 2 trends. What about a third?
There has to be a balance between standards, regulation, technology, and the business case. At the moment, the technology is moving at such a rate that it's a problem. I think one of the big problems is the regulators are now suddenly in the spotlight. Do they have the right people? Do they have the right qualifications? Do they have the right sources to look at how they're going to regulate machine learning systems, especially if machines are learning as they go along? How do you really plan for that and plan for the scaling up of that? So I think regulators are coming under increasing pressure. And the other interesting thing that's happening, of course, is the dynamic between Europe, the USA, and China, especially with the development of Chinese autonomous air taxis arriving before we have piloted air taxis in the West. That is a really interesting dynamic, which will create even more confusion, delays, and disruption, I think, in the regulatory system.
Is there some sort of race between China, Europe, and the United States to be the first to figure this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 races. There's a military race and there's a civil race. And the military race is to get some of these electric transport pilotless aircraft into the front line as soon as possible. And I think that's entirely understandable. On the civil side, what China is doing, I think, is extremely intelligent in being able to provide those countries who aren't developing their own systems with a complete ecosystem, from the air traffic management to the vertiport to the aircraft, a full system and fully autonomous, which means that you could well start to see these ecosystems developing in cities and countries who at the moment don't have a very developed aviation system. So that's really interesting. And I think, if it works, and I'm sure there's a lot of time, effort, and energy put into it, then autonomy will be here 10 years before Boeing and Airbus had considered it as a possibility.
That creates an interesting timescale challenge. How do we make up for that?
If we're looking at Paris as 2024, the Olympic Games as the kind of the formal opening of the global eVTOL urban air mobility market, which I think most people now recognize that. What's happened in France is that it's taken a national effort to do this. You need a national program, simply because the rules, the regulations, the standards are just so complex that it can't be done by any city alone. So I think if you look at the pioneers of passenger carrying eVTOL services, they're those countries who have made them as national programs, Japan, Korea, France, places like that, who have identified a specific city at a specific time and then worked towards that with the full weight of the state behind that, with the regulatory system, with the infrastructure providers, with the local authorities, all working towards that one brief. And I think to begin with, at least, that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a national program. It's not one of those things which a single city or a region can do. It's a huge, monumental effort.
Are there any individual companies that have the capability or resources to really make a difference on their own?
I don't think so, because another thing that people haven't realized is this is a new type of industry. This is a completely new transport system. And we haven't really understood the full implications of demand yet, or of the project costs. So this is a push market. So people have developed technology and said, okay, now we're going to deliver this and you're going to enjoy it. But any understanding of what the market really wants, because it's so totally new. And I am sure that some places will say, this is great, we want it, we want lots of it. And other places will just say, we don't want any of it, thank you very much indeed. And it's very difficult to know at this stage of what the consumer, the public, the social demand for some of these services is going to be. I mean, I've seen here when people put up 5G masts, there's a lot of pressure against that. And that came out of nowhere for a lot of people. Well, I think that unless this is managed carefully, there could be quite a lot of social pressure against very rich people flying in electric air taxis around the city. It has to be based, I think, on a completely different dynamic than that.
Yeah, I agree. Air taxis are exciting. But like you say, city planners have to show how they'll fit into the overall mobility choices that people can use, whether it's buses, trains, rideshare, walking, bicycles, or air taxis.
Absolutely right. And I don't know how things are in the States, but in the UK, we still haven't agreed how e-scooters around towns are to be sort of regulated and how they should be integrated, if at all. So some towns just ban them and other towns welcome them. That's what's happening on a very small scale. Now, magnify that to the scale of what urban air mobility could become. And I think it shows that it's a lot more complex than a lot of people think.
Who's making the most progress right now in terms of advanced aviation projects?
If we just look at drones for a second, I think that the real accelerators are ports, and specifically the ports in the north of Europe, places like Hamburg, Antwerp, Rotterdam. Those are the places which are the perfect incubator environments for developing complex drone operations. You're seeing in places like Rotterdam, for example, now multiple drone operators starting to fly autonomously, mainly in trial mode at the moment, but doing all sorts of different jobs around the port, security, environmental monitoring, in an environment which is sort of hermetically sealed and an ecosystem which works. And I think ports are wonderful places for that. If the thing falls out of the sky, chances are it's going to fall on a dock or into the sea. So, but it's also a very complex place because you have a lot of issues about what's in a port and the whole issue of who owns what, permissions to fly over warehouses, hazardous material, all that is there. So it's a really good incubator. So I personally think that we're going to see how things are going to work on an urban scale. The best place to start that is in a port.
Are you familiar with the company Skyports and their construction of vertiports?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the issue of vertiports is a very, very simple one. So there is only one set of detailed guidance and certification criteria published anywhere in the world to build a vertiport, and that's in Dubai. And we have 3 developers building vertiports in Dubai. Lots of guidance material out there, lots of things that, that give you some indication of sizes and the rest of it, but nothing to the sort of kind of detail where you can just say, okay, we can now certify this because it's meets certification criteria. So Dubai is an incredibly important place to look at for that.
The physical infrastructure is one challenge, but there are also some operational issues that are going to have to be worked out.
We haven't gone to the basics of understanding, say, for example, not just how much foam and water you'll need to put out an eVTOL fire, but where you train the people, what certificated courses are available, who provides them with the certification, who actually looks at that course and just says, yeah. So until you've actually got that level of kind of governance understood, it's very difficult to build a business plan because the regulator might say, okay, we need 4 fully trained, full-time crash fire rescue people at every airport and with the following list of equipment. And that will play havoc with the business plans of quite a lot of vertiport and eVTOL operators.
I've heard this comparison, and I've used it as well, that air taxis or eVTOLs are very similar to helicopters in that they operate in the same airspace and can even land on the same heliports. Is that an oversimplification?
I think we have to start somewhere. And that's, unless you're going to rewrite absolutely everything, helicopters is a good place to start, but it requires an enormous amount of adaptation. For example, helicopter performance is entirely different from an eVTOL's performance, especially in high winds. We don't actually yet know all sorts of things about eVTOL operations in high-density airspace. You can't create a high-density airspace eVTOL operating system where you've got to have an eVTOL flying around for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, waiting to find a landing slot. There's a problem with the vertiport, for example. You just won't be able to do that. So you have to design a system in which the flow control system is integrated into the air traffic management system, which is not something you need to do necessarily with a helicopter, because it'll have the reserves, it'll have much greater reserves available. So those are the kind of considerations which I don't think have yet been fully understood.
There's a single vertiport in Seoul that in the short run will offer a demonstration of the technology as an entertainment option. People will pay to fly in the electric vehicle, landing at the same spot where they took off. What do you think of this initial business model?
I think that makes a lot of sense. If you look at Paris, for example, there are 3 scheduled routes and a whole number of tourist routes you can take. And I think tourism is a brilliant start, because the one thing which this industry needs is enthusiasm and excitement. So there's one thing perhaps which is missing from all of these things. We're very concerned about the engineering and the regulatory side, but this could be really good fun. And I think that's missing. I think if people really spend a lot of time on social media saying, wow, this was absolutely brilliant, then I think that could be the best marketing tool of all, really.
Yeah, I think it would help reduce people's fear or hesitancy of the technology.
I think there's absolutely no question about that whatsoever. If you look at all the work that's been done around public consultation, the public doesn't just have to be sort of rather grudgingly okay about this. They have to be enthused. They have to be supportive. They have to say, we want this. This is going to make our lives a lot easier. It's going to be a fun thing to have. And we really want that. And until they actually see and experience these flights and see what they can do and understand, well, from my own personal point of view, how many lives you could save by getting defibrillators into places which they otherwise couldn't get to, or getting remote households connected to supply chains. Until you've actually experienced that, then all the public consultation and theoretical surveys in the world aren't any use, because you've got to see it. And some of the questions they ask, when we did some work on this, they're not the questions that you think the public will be interested in asking. They're not questions like, are they safe? I remember one bizarre question coming up was, what do they smell like? And I have absolutely no answer to that at all, because I don't know what they smell like. But you're not going to get the concerns that you think you will get.
One thing that I've learned in all my years as a city planner is that the public knows what they want. And in many instances, it's different than what we as city planners think. So I think you're right. Now I'd like to switch gears and talk about the global air mobility market map. Can you tell us about it?
I think we're at about 153 cities now are planning in their urban air mobility, and their passenger carrying and their advanced air mobility, which is sort of regional electric vehicle services, what they're planning, the routes that they're planning, who they're working with, what their timescales are, and what their visions are. So we're up to 55 countries, I think, who have some kind of national plan, and 153 cities or regions who have some either very sort of long-term plan or a very immediate plan to develop these services. And what we've done is that we've put it in a database so you can look at it, so you can see what the route lengths are, what the plan maps are, to get some idea of whether people are looking at 5, 6 kilometers or 20 kilometers or 100 kilometers for the initial services. And we also put it into a format so you can look at what's happening in the next 2 or 3 years, the next 5 or 6 years, the next 10 years. There's so much time and effort gone into looking at certifying aircraft without actually understanding what the market is on the ground and what is being planned on the ground. So that's what we wanted to do, and that's what we've been developing for the last 2 or 3 years.
Is it primarily a database, or does it also include some analysis or synthesis of what's happening across the various cities?
It's a bit of both, really. So we have a country introduction where we sort of basically set the scene for every country, what the roadmaps are, what the overall plans are. And from that, you can do quite a bit of analysis. And indeed, we also have a sister publication, which we outline all the roadmaps that we know about, along with all the regulations and the standards that have been developed and that's updated continually. But the global urban air mobility market map is essentially just a database of plans. And then you can do your own analysis on that, because you can look at it, in many, many different ways. Who the partners are, the route lengths, as I said, whether it's imminent, whether it's long term. So it's up to you to do the analysis. What we provide is that raw data.
Can you give us an example of what users might learn by viewing the database?
There are huge markets in areas where you have archipelagos, places like the Caribbean, Greece, Indonesia, the Philippines. You can suddenly start to see that, wow, okay, this could be transformative for those particular areas. And that's something that doesn't appear very often. And until you actually see the whole market from a geographical point of view and from a demographic point of view, you can suddenly start to see, wow, okay, that's a tremendous opportunity there.
What format is the data available?
It's in a database format, so you can interrogate the database. It's also available as a download, so you can download the entire database in PDF or in Word format.
What stands out in your mind as the biggest innovations in urban air mobility?
Well, obviously the big thing is autonomy, artificial intelligence, and the role of humans in the loop. And I think the way that this is evolving, the speed with which it's coming on, and you don't realize exactly how powerful autonomy is until you actually start to employ it in the field. And I think we have a lot of ethical dilemmas which we need to address, which haven't yet been properly addressed, because I don't know how you do it. But the way in which machine learning autonomous systems can do things and can change the whole dynamic. It's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this particular area, because aerospace is the most exciting area where I think this could really change things. It's much, much faster than driverless cars or driverless trucks. I do think that this is the area where we will fundamentally start to really rethink the way that autonomous systems and humans work. And that means not just obviously in the piloting of these aircraft, but in the overall systems management, and how you introduce the right layers of robustness and reliability to make sure that there's always a backup system which will work without the whole thing collapsing. And it's very vague. I'm putting it in very vague terms, but I'm looking, for example, at the way that Switzerland is introducing a cloud-based air traffic control system, which 10 years ago, would have just been completely unheard of. But this whole idea of agile engineering, being able to fix things as you go along and applying it to something that's safety critical as air traffic management is a revolutionary change, which I don't think has fully been recognized yet. So I think that's one of the most exciting and interesting things happening.
Over the next couple of years, what do you believe will be the key milestones that when it happens, it will signal that the industry is really making headway in uncrewed air mobility?
I think, first of all, the first flights in Paris, that's going to be a huge thing. Any breakthrough in battery technology, you're looking, the introduction of the first electric regional aircraft as well, say 2028, 2030 hybrid or electrical regional, that's another huge milestone. I think EHang getting its operating license and its certification to fly and then scaling up enormously quickly will be another huge milestone, because that means autonomy will have arrived. Those are the things that really interest me, and I think are going to be standout events.
Where do the developments of urban air mobility rank in your 35 years of covering aviation?
So I was lucky enough to cover aviation in the 80s and the 90s, when we could still fly in Concorde, when there was genuine progress, and you felt that the brightest and the best went into aerospace, and everybody else lagged behind. Aerospace has kind of dropped back, I think, socially, in its social profile, in its industry profile. It's no longer attracting the brightest and the best. It's sort of IT, finance, media, all that sort of stuff. So that's a great shame. But we have an opportunity now to bring it back. We have an opportunity with space, with the greening of technology, with electric aviation, with the introduction of hydrogen, to suddenly make aviation sexy again. And I think that's incredibly important, because it is an exciting, dynamic industry, and it should attract the best engineers and the best technologists So that's important. But I think also the business side of thing, I think, is really interesting too, because I came into this because I had a bit of a business failure, but it was a fascinating, fun business failure, which I'm really glad we did. At the same time as they built a bridge between Malmo and Copenhagen, they found oil in the Mekong Delta. And before they built the bridge, they had to have these hovercraft, which went between Copenhagen and Sweden. And there's a friend of mine who came up with this brilliant idea, once the bridge was built, of taking the hovercraft and moving it down to the Mekong Delta where they've found oil and using it as a transport system for the people on the rigs to get passengers, goods, and all the rest of it from the rigs onto the land in Vietnam. Because there was nothing in the Mekong Delta. I don't know if you've been there, but there's nothing on the side. It's all very fertile arable land, but no inhabitants. So he set up this company. It's a brilliant idea. And the hovercraft captain, but yeah, they're really up for it. The Vietnamese government said, absolutely, let's do this. The oil rig companies were very, very interested. This is terrific. So we formed a company. It all went very well. All we needed was a stamp from the local People's Committee Transport Department to give us permission to use hovercraft on these routes. And the guy who had the stamp in his hand, he looked at it and he just said, no, I'm not doing it. And I said, well, we got, thousands of pounds have been invested in it. We've got people coming in from all over the world. This is going to be a huge, huge, huge enterprise. It's going to transform your economy. All these good things are going to happen. And he said, no, I'm just not going to do it. And the project ended in a failure. I was frustrated. I thought, well, why? Why? When there's so many upsides. It's only several years later, and I started to sit back and think, he's absolutely right. He had absolutely no idea. No one had done it before. He had no idea of the liabilities of what happens if there was a major incident. He had no idea of the environmental aspects of any of this. So he was right not to put that stamp on the bit of paper. And that taught me an enormous lesson, really, is that you've got to get all the stakeholders involved. So I think this is, if you can get stakeholders involved, if you can get everybody having an interest in that, even if it's just been overflown and they're not flying themselves, but they want to know what's going on and they're interested in it, then that will make the difference. So that to me was a great lesson, is that every stakeholder has to be enthused, not just tacitly approving, but actually saying, we want this.
I think that's a great observation and a good point to end on. Philip, is there anything that we missed that we should talk about?
Everything has to be seen in the right perspective. So I think there is an issue. I think there is a challenge. I don't think it's as big of a challenge as many people think there are, because I think there are technologies now available to spot, identify, track, and deal with drones that shouldn't be where they are. The problem is not the technology, it's the institutional arrangements. So I think quite clearly we need to overhaul our abilities, not just to identify drones in the wrong place. We can spot their intent quite quickly through the use of AI and then mitigate them quickly. And that means having new people empowered to make sure there's an appropriate response if there's a rogue drone in an area where it shouldn't be. And that, I think, is going to be very difficult for governments to feel comfortable about. Leaving it just to the police or the security agencies, I don't think is the best solution. There has to be a new way, I think, of empowering people to mitigate the drone problem in an appropriate way. 99% of incidents are going to be because people have been clueless or careless and can be rectified very easily and quickly. But for that 1% or less than 1%, there needs to be an appropriate kind of backstop where we can apply mitigation measures. And that's an institutional as much as a technical problem.
And for my final question, Philip, what message would you like to leave regarding urban air mobility?
It's got to be fun. I mean, I do think this component is missing. And I just think that there's a whole new generation of people out there who will experience aviation in a different way for the first. I am really looking forward to getting up into one of these things and flying around and just seeing the world in a different way.
That's it for episode 405 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Philip Butterworth-Hayes of Unmanned.Airspace.info. I want to thank Philip for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about Unmanned.Airspace.info or want to connect with Philip, check out the webpage at unmannedairspace.info. If you like the Drone Radio Show, then please subscribe and share, write a glowing review on iTunes, and if you're able, donate to keep the podcast going. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.